Well, we will get started, and if you don't know me, I'm Superintendent Rob Miller. I think I know most of you in here. I've seen a couple new faces from our previous two sessions. Thank you for being here. As I said the last two times, the purpose of these panels or these discussions really is to provide information. That's one of the things that we don't always have the time to share the intricacies of school funding, how it all works, the impact of decisions that Representative Waldron and Representative Banning, as they do legislation and create policy, and how that impacts our school district. They're not meant to be debates. They're really not a panel. We each have a perspective to share with those in the room. But for the most part, is to give you information through the lens of Bixby Public Schools. And in a bigger picture, public schools in Oklahoma. Because there are a lot of challenges that we're experiencing as a public school, as a school district, and the decisions that are being made in Oklahoma City every week, certainly every year, have a direct impact on what we can provide, the services we can provide our teachers and our students, and the support that we give our families and our programs. So thank you for being here. We ask that you ask questions as we're going through, share the information with friends and family members. This will be posted on our YouTube channel after, so if you want to go back and look at some of that, you're welcome to do it, or just call one of us directly, 366-2200, and say, hey, I'd like to talk with Mr. Miller about this that he talked about, or I'd like to talk with our CFO about how this funding mechanism works. Any of those sorts of things, we are completely open to answering your questions at any time. So, Representative Waldron, I'm going to give you the mic for a second to introduce yourself, and then Kayla, I'll do the same thing, about 60 seconds, just who you are, why you're here today, and your perspective as a teacher and former teacher.
All right. Thank you, Superintendent Miller. I'm John Waldron, House District 77. If you've ever been to the Admiral Twin for a drive-in movie, you've been in the heart of my district. I'm a public school teacher. I taught at Booker T for 20 years. Go Hornets. I was a social studies teacher, and I got elected during the year of the teacher walkout. I was part of the teacher wave that year. So I'm in my 5th year in the legislature, fighting for better education policy, better education budget, services for all Oklahomans, and respect for public school teachers. And I would not be a social studies teacher if I did not mention that democracy would not have survived without the Spartans, who in 479 took a stand against the Persians. So go Spartans too.
Hi, I'm Kayla Cardwell. I'm a 2nd grade teacher at Bixby West Elementary. I moved to Oklahoma 2 years ago from my home state of New Mexico. So this is my 9th year as a classroom teacher. And I am here to offer a perspective of a public school educator and be a voice for teachers and kind of inform you on what the experience like is for us right now in public education in Oklahoma.
And thank you, Kayla, for being here. I know we just asked you a couple days ago, so we appreciate you taking time away from your classroom to be here today. This is why we're here to discuss this today, teachers. And on the screen behind me are some of our fantastic teachers here at Bixby Public Schools. And I'll point out just a couple of them that are in here. This one over here is receiving her 30-year service pin. Kathy Peters up here has over 30 years, and Ms. Sue Ward has over 40 years. So just those 3 teachers on the slide have over 100 years of service to public education. That's pretty remarkable. And I want to start today really by having us all think about a teacher, maybe more than one teacher, or a coach that has personally impacted you in your life's journey. That may be the reason why you're here today, or why you're in the business that you're currently in, or has affected some other aspect of your life that's helped you be the person that you are today. So take about 15, 20 seconds, just think about who that person might be and then we'll share out. All right, we'll just kind of do this in popcorn fashion. Does somebody have, just give me a name and just a very quick sentence as to why that person made such an impact on your life? Just raise your hand and anybody want to volunteer?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Vicki Elliott, Tahlequah High School. She was science teacher, high expectations. She also was a coach, so that ended up being part of my journey. And to this day, I still love her and we communicate.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Jolie?
My first grade teacher in South Texas, Beverly Banks. I'm over at half century old, and we still send Christmas cards every year. But she just kind of, enforced and wanted us to be creative, and I still am creative to this day, so I still have it for her.
Those of us who know Jolie Flagler can attest to your creativity. Absolutely. I think it's phenomenal anytime somebody remembers a first grade teacher that well, because I'm not sure I had first grade teacher. I'm sure you don't. So, Glenda Nelson, do you have somebody that pops into your mind? I hate to put you on the spot. I know.
Mostly the people that I worked with, to tell you
Okay.
the truth. I had such respect for all the people I worked with. I saw how much they loved the kids, how much they cared for them, the time that they poured into them. It's humbling to work with such marvelous people.
It is. Thank you, Glenda. Mayor Guthrie, anybody that you can think of from your years and helped you get to where you are today?
Who comes to my mind is my first grade teacher, Miss Pease. Okay. I think it was later my daughter's teacher as well.
For any particular reason, or just she was a phenomenal teacher?
She was a good teacher. I always remembered her for some reason. So I don't remember any details, but she must have had some impact.
Anybody else out here? Representative Waldron, do you have a name in mind?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I would give a shout out. An interesting fact about me: I was private school educated, Catholic schools K through 12. But I would say that my headmaster in high school, Father Giles, was a really formative person. I was one of 9 kids. When it came time for college, I didn't think I had much in the way of financial prospects. And he said, "John, the money will take care of itself." And he gave me faith to pursue an education, and it paid off. So this is for Father Giles.
Kayla, how about you? Again, I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. My high school English teacher, Robin Jackson, she was just absolutely phenomenal. She inspired many, many generations of students in my hometown, and she made learning fun and engaging and just had such a dynamic personality and made such an impact on every single student. And most students from my high school would cite her as one of the most impactful teachers they had.
It's fantastic. And I think if we had the time, we could go around the room and every single one of us has a story to share of a teacher who just took a moment, or whether they were a fantastic teacher, knew their content well, but most of the time it's not necessarily that they were just knew their science really well or they knew English grammar really well. It was how they made you feel, where they encouraged you, they supported you, they caused you to rise above those limits that you set for yourself and be more than what you could be. I've told the story many times about a teacher at Charles Page High School in Sand Springs, Alan Mogwin, for whom I would not be an educator today. I certainly wouldn't be a school superintendent. I may not have gone to college because, like Representative Waldron, I didn't have resources to go to college. So it was get a scholarship or not. And that teacher took a personal interest in me and helped me secure a scholarship that led me to serve in the Marine Corps for 10 years and then be an educator for the last 30. And I just want to keep that as kind of a light note, but a positive note about the topic that we're going to talk about today, because we are in a crisis in public education, not just in Oklahoma, but across the nation, when it comes to recruiting and retaining high-quality teachers for our kids. We all know that the quality of that human being in front of those kids every single day is the single biggest factor in whether kids feel safe, accepted, valued, and whether they learn to their full potential every single day. And so, as an educator now, I take it as my mission. That's the most important thing that I do as a superintendent, is to try and recruit and hire the best teachers we possibly can, and then support them to the best of our ability once we get them on board. So all of this is through that lens, and I'm going to go back just a little bit. Here's just our agenda for today, is really talk about all of those issues that are challenging us today about how do we retain teachers. It's no surprise that these past few years have been challenging, especially with COVID and pivoting to online learning and all of the stress and strain associated with being an educator. Kids are still kids, but kids are coming from different backgrounds than what we were exposed to even when I started teaching 30 years ago. They also have cell phones, and they have all sorts of other distractions that we're trying to work around. Our world is different than it was just a couple decades ago. And so our teachers have to constantly absorb that while still trying to do their best to teach the things that they're asked to teach. I want to talk just real briefly, because we're all hearing those stories, those narratives out there about public schools and about public schools failing. And there is an impression or a mischaracterization that public schools have gone through some sort of transformation in the last decade or two, that we're no longer teaching reading and math and social studies and love of country, that we don't let kids pray in school, that we spend our time talking about SEL and graduate level social theory. It's not true. We could walk out of here right now, walk over to Central Elementary, into any one of those elementary classrooms, and we would see that those students, as they're coming in the classroom, were being welcomed by their teacher with a hug or a high five or a smile. They were going into that classroom. They start their day with a Pledge of Allegiance. They start their day with a moment of silence. They have the opportunity to reflect, meditate, or pray if they choose. We talk about GE life principles and the importance of responsibility and empathy and courtesy. And then we get about the business of teaching kids how to read and do math and learn about American history and world history and art and music and all the same things that we did. So when you hear these narratives, there are stories out there. I'm sure you can cherry pick stories from something that happened in California or happened in New York. Those are not happening in Bixby Public Schools. And if they were, or if they did, they wouldn't happen for very long, because we would squash it. That's not the school district that we want to have here, and it's just not happening. I say that because that rhetoric is harmful, because the teachers are in this room, teacher right up here, they hear that. And even though they know it's not about them, they still hear that rhetoric about public schools and that we're off track, or that the unions are trying to perpetrate this left-wing agenda in our schools. It's not true. And it really is frustrating, because these teachers work so hard every single day to do what's right for kids. And we have to keep the focus on that and make sure that even as we have vigorous debates about topics, as the representative here has vigorous debates yesterday.
Too vigorous.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, we have to bring it back to what do we need to do to support our teachers so that we can support our kids. So some of the issues we're going to talk about here is, what are the impact of some of these financial decisions, these funding decisions that the state is making, and how does that impact our decision making? When we talk about class sizes, we all recognize that we want our class sizes to be as low as possible. We also want our teachers to receive a competitive pay and salary so that we can keep them. Well, that's all coming out of the same bucket of money. So it is a balancing act, and we've got to be able to do that. And then how that process works, because right now the legislature, each side has passed some funding bills for public education this year, and it appears that they're both dead on arrival in the other house. So, and we'll let the representative talk about that here in just a little bit. But at the end of this session, they will have to approve a budget. And how the timing and the numbers associated with that budget impact us today and the decisions we have to make. This is true, right? Help wanted, teachers. We need high-quality teachers. We need more high-quality teachers. And I'm going to show you some other slides here real quickly. These are a little startling. The picture on the left shows Oklahoma's teacher shortage, and this is from the Oklahoma State School Board Association. They do an annual survey about how many vacancies there are. There are 543 unfilled teaching positions in Oklahoma. Many of those in math, science, special ed. There's been 1,530 positions eliminated. It's not because of fewer students, it's because schools can no longer fund some of those elective programs, and so they reduce teaching positions, which increases class sizes of the teachers that are still there. That number of emergency certificates, we're going to come back to that. That's not accurate. This is from 2018, I believe. This survey was done by NEA, and it talks about retention rates, and this one is really disturbing. If you look at new teachers coming into the profession and what happens in those first 5 years, by the 5th year, about half of those teachers are gone. No longer working. So those Sue Wards with 43 years and some of those other teachers we have with 30 and 40 years, those are becoming very few and far between. And it's not just what's going on in education, it is they have other opportunities. My daughter was an example. She kind of thought about being a teacher, but then thought about being a nurse. She went into nursing instead for primarily financial reasons. And she's making significantly more as a nurse in her 12th year than any teacher that we have in our state in their 12th year. This one's pretty disturbing. This is after the pandemic and the effect. What has been the effect of COVID on our teachers' state of mind relative to the profession of teaching? 55% now are saying, I'm not sure I'm in this for the long haul. Maybe a few more years, but I'm actively seeking other opportunities. So teaching may not be that lifelong goal that I wanted to have. And only 1% have been encouraged to work even longer and retire. You know what, I'll throw this to you. You talk with your colleagues all the time. And just the impact of the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, some of the narratives that are out there that I alluded to. Can you share just a little bit from your perspective what that feels like in your school building, in your classroom with your fellow teachers?
So COVID was really hard for everyone, not just teachers, but it has hit us especially hard, and we are still dealing with the ramifications of all that happened during those 2 to 3 years. Things in our students have just changed. The world has changed. So it has made teaching a lot more difficult, a lot more frustrating at times, and it is a very common sentiment amongst all of us. We all share that feeling. And we are navigating as we go. There is no roadmap for how to deal with post-pandemic students. None of us have ever lived through that before, so we're sort of flying blind at times and just figuring it out as we go, which is hard and scary, and we worry about making the wrong decision or not, doing what's best for our students, even though that's always our intention. So it's a lot of added stress and worry and anxiety for all of us.
Thank you very much. And that's a great point when you teach second grade, correct? So think about the students that are in her class now. their pre-K year, their kindergarten year were significantly disrupted. First grade was a little disrupted, but now they're in second grade, and we want them to be at the same level that second graders have been for years and years. But they have huge gaps in their learning, as well as how to do school. The simple stuff, right? How to come into a classroom, how to sit still, all those things that are now a big challenge for teachers that they didn't have before. The number I want to point to on this one is, this is superintendents fill out this survey every year again. 67% say it's harder this year to hire good teachers than it ever has been. I can say when I was a principal in my first few years, the number of jobs we would post a middle school math position, we would typically have 20 or 25 applications at James Middle School. Now, if we post a math position at Bixby Middle School, we're lucky to get one, because there are so few and far between. And that's the challenge that we all have, is where are these teachers going to come from? This should startle everyone, and I don't want to speak disparagingly about any teacher who has come into the profession on an emergency certificate. They have made a decision to change their life's focus and be an educator and try and make a difference in the lives of kids. But we all recognize that somebody going through a traditional teaching program where they have done internships and they have learned teaching methods and they've gone through all the coursework necessary to be a fully certified teacher, that's different than somebody who has a bachelor's degree in health or business and then gets an emergency certificate. It's not the same. Some of those teachers wind up being great because they're quick learners, they're willing to accept feedback, they get there. But the fact that 10% of Oklahoma's educators are emergency certified. 1 out of every 10. That's a disturbing number.
And I would add that another 1% are adjunct teachers.
Yes. Good segue. You looked at my slides. And then the law changed a few years. Before, as an adjunct teacher, and this is somebody who simply has a background. So if we wanted to hire, an example I use, a horticulture teacher, somebody to teach that, and we had somebody who works in that profession in our community, and we wanted them to come on campus for 1 or 2 hours to teach that to students, that was the traditional role of an adjunct, somebody who was considered an expert, didn't have teacher certificates, but was qualified to teach that to others. But now, with the change in law, we can open that up, and now it's just our best, endorsement that, yeah, we believe this teacher will do okay. And we have a pretty firm bar in Bixby. We're not just going to put anybody in a classroom. And I think most districts have that. But because the law is written the way it is, and schools have to have an adult in that classroom, I see that some districts will probably water down the quality of their teaching staff because they have to have somebody in those classrooms. So now we're up to somewhere, 13 to 15% of our teachers are not with a regular certificate. Did you want to say anything more on that, Representative Waldron, relative to adjuncts and some of those conversations?
I would just say that the dialogue around adjunct teachers should be of concern. Initially, a superintendent approached a senator with the argument that there were doctors and bankers and lawyers who might like to contribute to a classroom, but couldn't because they'd have to go through a certification process. And so it was anticipated and argued in committees that this is what would happen. But I don't believe that we have 2,400 bankers, doctors, and lawyers now adjuncting in our classrooms. And it's a good example of what happens when our education policy is designed by non-educators. They believe certain assumptions that somebody who's a veteran in the field would know would not be reliable.
Thank you. So the issue that comes up all the time is pay and compensation, right? And the good news is that we've made some progress. Back in 2017, 2018, we were in a bad place. And that was the year we had the teacher walkout. That year, our legislature and the governor signed off on a $6,100 across the board pay raise for all of our certified teachers. And that was huge because it had come after years of just flat or stagnant pay raises. There hadn't been any. And so with inflation and all the other things associated with that, we were way behind. We were dead last in our region by a mile. You can see what's happened here. This is, again, a year dated, but Oklahoma's right there in the middle at 54,804. So we're kind of in that average. Texas, Colorado lead the pack in terms of average teacher compensation. The regional average is 55,000. So we're just under that. What I want to remind everybody is, again, this is a year old, and guess what all the other states are doing in response to the teacher shortage? Raising pay. So we can say, well, we're doing good now, but if we're not doing what Arkansas and Texas are doing, then they're going to continue to poach teachers from across the border to fill their ranks because they're in the same boat as we are. So here's a 6-year look going back from 2016-17 school year through 22. We've had a 21% increase because in 2019 there was another $1,200, so a total of $7,300 was added to that. So as I said, that's something to celebrate. But since 2019, there's been nothing. In fact, last year, as I shared in one of our other sessions, the state funding for Common Ed went up 0.5% when inflation was 8%. And
We ran a surplus that year.
Right. So now we've got money. We know that the legislature is dealing with kind of an unprecedented amount of new revenues from a variety of reasons. But how that money gets appropriated and finds its way to school districts will be very important. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but if you hit that QR code at the bottom of your handout, you'll be able to see some of the things that are going on. This last one, we now have 1,000 vacancies in Oklahoma in teaching positions. So where are those filled? If we can't find a teacher we can get emergency certified, or a teacher that we can classify as an adjunct, then we fill it with a substitute, a long-term substitute who has to have a high school diploma. And we vet those people and we try and get the very highest quality substitutes we can, but we all know that's not ideal for our kids in our schools. I want to take just a second. Now, Kayla's going to talk about her pay stub and some of the impacts that she's had moving from one state to another. But Representative Waldron, let me give you an opportunity just for a few minutes to talk about some of the legislation that the House has already approved. We talked about it in our first session here briefly. The Senate has now passed a package of bills with Senator Pugh's, part of his retention. I forget all of his R's, but and kind of where we are at this point in the legislature with teacher pay and compensation.
Okay, thank you very much. We're just at the phase of the legislature, which I like to call the do-si-do, because this is the moment when House and Senate exchange bills with each other. And the Democratic caucus, which is my caucus, House Democrats and House Senators are about to sit down and talk about the bills and what went on in each chamber. When it comes to education, though, I think that do-si-do is going to focus on 3 R's: regulations, raises, and rhetoric. When it comes to regulations, the conditions that affect teachers, we've done some good things and we've done some bad things. We passed a bill off the House floor. Representative Provenzano ran a bill which will reduce professional learning commitments for educators, remove redundant instruction, allow teachers to count some of their professional learning for longer periods, take some things off the plates of educators who are already given lots to do. Some of the other regulations, we've Well, we've also taken sex education off the plates of educators before the 6th grade, though I'm not sure I would say that's a good thing. We ignored a lot of science-based approaches. There's a 4th grade unit, your bodies, your changing bodies, that we will have to stop offering if this legislation advances. We stopped a bill that would have required schools and educators to put all of their content up on a website for anyone to review with a forum for public comments and complaints that would not have been restricted to people in the school community. Anybody could have taken a crack at any educator over any lesson at our expense to a private vendor that would have provided the website whose job would be to look over every teacher's shoulder. So that was an example of a bad regulation, which luckily we stopped. We've done, on the field of raises in the House, we're proposing a small raise. I think it's $2,500. It's tied to a few other things, though, in a kind of chain gang approach to education. It would be tied to vouchers and a per pupil increase that would have some, I think, interesting effects. Fiscally speaking, the raises would be tied to investments in education that would amount to, for a small town Oklahoma, up to $745 per pupil. Urban communities like Tulsa would get about $62 new per pupil. And the voucher plan that was advanced would give $5,000 to per pupil, mostly to families whose kids were already attending private schools, and presumably because they could afford those private schools. Well, we envision that maybe there would be a 2% increase in the number of students admitted to private schools who would qualify for that voucher. So that's a little difficult. Then we come to the rhetoric or respect angle. And I have to say, the good news is we have spent less time beating up on educators in the legislature this year. We did have a throwaway comment about teachers sharing pornography in a pornography bill yesterday. We still have attacks especially coming from our superintendent of education / secretary of education, who continues to go after libraries with unsubstantiated comments about inappropriate material in libraries. And I would say there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what libraries do. Libraries are not supposed to provide students with grade level appropriate material. Your librarian is supposed to provide you with material that's appropriate for you. And how many of you read above or below your grade level in different years? There you go, above, I'm guessing. And so when it comes to the rhetoric and respect, we are getting better currently, but I would say that that's because we're at the end of a multi-year effort to talk down public education. I think we are still seeing the backlash from the teacher walkout. We still have legislators who were very angry that 50,000 people showed up at the Capitol to tell them to do their jobs. We're seeing attacks on unions. There's the liberal teacher unions that their union bosses that apparently dominate politics in the state are under constant attack. And there has been a concerted effort against the urban school districts, including the funding formula measure I just mentioned. There was even an effort to try to break Tulsa public schools up into smaller school districts. I think all of that is about power. In 2018, the people of Oklahoma demonstrated that they cared about public education, and there was significant political power behind it, and it got us to do some of the virtuous things that you saw in those charts. But in response, the powers that be in Oklahoma City want to make sure that doesn't happen again, so they have engaged in a multi-year effort to shift the rhetoric away from public support for public education and into criticisms and specific attacks, things like critical race theory that aren't in our public schools, as a way to undermine the power basis for supporting our public schools. That's not really about CRT or age-appropriate materials or what's going on in the classroom. That's about money, and that's about power. The good news is the rhetoric has toned down a little bit this year. We're busy attacking transgender athletes, students, people instead. The bad news is that the rhetoric has toned down because a lot of that work has already been accomplished of undermining support for public education in the state.
Kayla, I'm going to pass to you now and give you an opportunity to share your perspective as a new teacher to Oklahoma. And again, your conversations with colleagues about pay and all those other things. And I want to be sure that we're saying this, pay is one aspect of teacher satisfaction, just one. But if you've ever read Daniel Pink, there's a book he wrote called Drive, and he talks about those things that motivate us as human beings. And it really boils down to three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But pay is an issue until it's not an issue. So if you can't afford to make it through the month and pay your bills, pay is an issue. But if you can pay your bills, even you're just making it, it's not as big an issue. But for so many of our teachers right now, it is. It is literally living paycheck to paycheck and having to make difficult decisions about whether we get our 10-year-old car fixed or whether we pay groceries for the next week or so. So I'm going to let Kayla kind of talk and give her perspective on that.
So, as I said before, I moved to Oklahoma 2 years ago from New Mexico, where I taught for 7 years. I taught kindergarten, and I have a master's degree in reading and literacy with an emphasis in instructional technology. When I moved to Oklahoma to be closer to family, I moved here with the knowledge that I would take somewhat of a pay cut to teach here, but I wanted to continue in education, so I decided I could do that. The reality of living with that pay cut has been a lot more difficult than I anticipated. I also currently have a second job. In June of last year, I started working at Margaritaville at River Spirit Casino as a server, and I have continued throughout the school year. So I teach all week, and then I work my second job as a server on the weekends, and it is exhausting. I typically work Friday and Saturday nights until 1 or 2 in the morning, and then Sunday afternoon I'm back in my classroom preparing for the week ahead. So I don't get a lot of free time for myself or to spend with my family, and it's hard. It's really, really hard. It's not fun, and it makes contemplating my future in education difficult. My fear is that soon it won't be a choice for me to continue as a teacher. That choice will be made for me because I am a single person. I do not have a spouse or children yet, so my income is all I have to live on, both of them. And soon I won't be able to sustain myself on my teaching salary, which is heartbreaking. I love being a teacher. I am incredibly proud to be an educator, specifically in Bixby. I love this district very much. I love my school. I love my coworkers. I love my students. There's no part of me that wants to leave education anytime soon. In fact, I'm still pursuing further education to specialize more in reading and literacy so that I can do better for my students and help more of them. But I just don't know that that will be an option for me much longer if things continue the way that they are. One of my lifelong friends is also a teacher, still a teacher in New Mexico, in my hometown. We were hired literally the same day, so we have the same number of years of experience. She also has a master's degree. I had a conversation with her yesterday in preparation for this. Her current salary, base salary, is $70,100. Mine is currently $44,000. We have all the same credentials. There is nothing that should separate us by that amount of money, but it does because Oklahoma has not funded public education or given their teachers raises to keep pace with the states around us. So again, I want to reiterate that I love teaching. No part of me wants to leave. A huge part of my identity is being a teacher. If you were to ask someone from the corporate world, what do you do for work? They say, I work in banking. I work in finance. If you ask a teacher, they say, I am a teacher. It's who we are. It's not just what we do. I am a teacher from the top of my head to the bottom of my toes, and all of my coworkers are too. So to have to potentially make decisions to support ourselves to support our families that would take us away from the thing that we love, from who we are, is gut-wrenching, and it's not fair. We deserve to be compensated as the educated and experienced individuals that we are.
You should just drop the mic and we should all just leave. That's right.
Exactly.
It was a powerful testimony. And I mean, if you can't hear what's on her heart, unfortunately, it's on the heart of many of our teachers who are doing the same thing, that love what they do, that love coming to school every day and interacting with kids in positive ways and building relationships and making a difference. But at the same time, you have to pay the bills. And we all know that with inflation, some teachers are fortunate. Maybe they've got a spouse who makes good money and they can kind of look at this as a second job, but that's not the norm anymore. It's, if you have two teachers, husband and wife, both working, they're still struggling to try and get everything, especially if they have kids and they're paying for health care, they're paying for rent, all those sorts of things. So I wanted to share, we're not going to go into a lot of detail about some of these, but this is a teacher, and I don't know whose this is. You can see him on the side slides as well. This is a pay stub from one of our first-year teachers by themselves on insurance. Now, our state does fully fund the employee portion of their health insurance, which is a great thing. And if the teacher chooses that, they don't have to pay any extra. If they choose a more expensive plan, that's an option, then it comes out of their pocket. Or they can choose a less expensive plan. Or they can choose not to have insurance at all if they have a spouse or other means to get insurance, but they only get paid $69 in exchange for that, in lieu of that amount of money. So they don't get that full amount if they don't choose it. So this teacher making basically, say, $39,300, which is our base pay, they're bringing home $2,500.60 after taxes, after all those normal deductions that we all pay. Sounds like a lot of money, right? Not. How much does it cost to rent a house nowadays or an apartment? If you find one less than $1,000, especially in Bixby, you're pretty lucky. And then utilities, and then car payment if you have a car payment, and car insurance, and food and clothes and taking care of your children and all those other things. $2,560 doesn't do it. And that's why many of our teachers do have side hustles, as we call them, or other jobs to be able to live in a way that they're not worried as much about paycheck to paycheck. But here's what it looks like if you actually, if you are a single parent with two kids and you don't have any means of insuring those kids otherwise, that comes out, that area in blue there. Our health insurance is very expensive for a spouse or dependents. Unlike state workers who have a family plan, which covers all of them, and is it $1,800 or somewhere around that?
It was a big raise to shift my child from my wife's insurance to mine. But
so state workers get about $1,800 a month, and our teachers get that $640. So even changing that would make a huge difference. But we all recognize that $1,800 for a single parent with two kids, you're not going to make it. You're going to be living with parents, or you're going to be trying to do something else. Even a 10-year teacher, two kids, self-insurance. And if you're insuring dependents, that money comes straight out of your pay. One of the things I will say about Bixby Public Schools, when you compare salaries from one district to another, an important factor is retirement. Our state does have an outstanding retirement plan for teachers and those support staff who contribute to it as well. We really do. It hasn't always been that way. But now I think it's about 73% fully funded, and it is a defined benefit. And there are people in the legislature who want to access that money and change it around. But for many people who have retired, it is critically important that they know they have that assurance that when I hit this age level or when I make the decision to retire, that money's going to be there. and it is by now. That retirement, Oklahoma teacher retirement, also pumps $1.8 billion into the Oklahoma economy every single year through retirement pay. So that's something that we shouldn't touch, and I hope nobody at the legislature is even talking about doing anything with OTRS right now. So let's talk real quickly about where we are in Bixby, because I know we've got limited time. We are growing. I've mentioned that in our previous two sessions. We're now at 7,910 students. When I got to Bixby, we're at 6,200. That was less than 5 years ago. So we've grown dramatically in that amount of time. When we've had, this is our last graduating class in the 400s, we'll have had 9 consecutive years where we've had 400 plus. Looking at this chart, we'll then have 3 years where we're 500 plus, and then 600 plus, and likely 700 plus by the time these classes get through. We're projected to have close to 10,000 students in 6 years in Bixby Public Schools. So we are growing quickly. There's a lot of land. That's a good problem. We'd much rather be a growing district than one that's stagnant or declining in enrollment, because that means that we do get additional funding through the state formula. But we've got to be able to build schools fast enough. So last time I talked about bonding capacity and our ability to build classrooms and schools quickly enough in order to house these students. And we are bursting at the seams right now. Oh, what happened to that? Oh, there it is. Oh, back here. These are accurate numbers as of today. And none of us in this room like those numbers. So we started the year in elementary at 23-24. But with enrollment during the school year, we've grown 12 kids since Monday. Seriously. Since the end of spring break, we've grown 12 kids. So right now, our K-3 class size average is 25-26. That's too many. It's too big. How many do you have, Kayla? 25. You're right in the average. Intermediate, 28-30. That's too many. Our secondary varies by size based on how their schedule works, but we've got some that are in the 30s and some that are lower than that based on how that schedule works out. Our priority in Bixby Public Schools and our first use of any additional funding we get from the state is to reduce that class size. For our K2 in particular, to 20-22. That's kind of our goal. That's where we'd love to be. For intermediate, 24-25, and then secondary, somewhere in that area as well. Around 25-26 would be a good target for us. Our district leadership team met a couple days ago to look at all of our needs across the district and where that we needed to hire additional teachers for next year. Right now we're at 28-40, 42 teachers that we need to hire right now to get our class sizes down. We built in a 7% growth factor. We used to do 3 to 5%, but we've been growing 7 to 10%. So we are trying to be as liberal with that estimate as we possibly can so that we don't find ourselves in a situation again. But that's 38 to 42 teachers, projected cost over $2 million. So that's where the money matters. In the first session, I talked about the House bills that have passed. There was a $300 million for public education, but it's capped. And so for Bixby, we would get $2 million because that's the level of the cap. Without that cap, we would get $3.5 million. If money, $300 million, wasn't being appropriated for tax credits for families at private school, that money would equal an additional $3.5 million for Bixby Public Schools. So with the teacher pay raise and that 3.5 and that 3.5, we would have about $8.5 million to not only address our class size issues, but address the pay issue. So we could take that $2,500 that the House line item right directly to that, and we could add $2,500.
And that could include support staff, which did not receive a designated raise, and is greatly needed.
So the discretionary aspect of that money is very useful for us because it gives us as a district the opportunity. We know where our needs are, and we need to fill those classrooms. Now, what's the other problem with this that ties back to something I mentioned in the very beginning? We need 38 to 42 new teachers at Bixby. Where are they coming from? Well, we can say that. We can post all those positions and say, hey, we're hiring. But if nobody files an application, then we're in the same boat. So we are in a situation here in the Tulsa area in particular where we simply steal from each other. Because I know Ms. Wilson and her team, they go to all the job fairs. How many teachers were at the OSU job fair?
Well, the OSU was this week, and it was the highest attended we've been to this year. And I think we brought back 21 resumes. And almost every candidate we talked to gave us a resume. There might have been 2 or 3 more that didn't.
So that's
and that was a high rate.
Right, and that's one of our largest schools of education, and they're graduating
Not very many. I didn't get a number.
25, 40
Yeah, they didn't share.
statewide. We need 40 here next year. So that's what causes us to really stress a little bit about this, a little bit of angst. And we do. We have to really reach into other school districts and say, hey, would you rather be in Bixby? And they're doing exactly the same thing. So,
And also at the OSU job fair, there were as many out-of-state employers as in-state.
yeah, because Texas shows up with those.
Texas had, I don't know how many schools there.
Contracts in hand.
And that's not uncommon, though. I know they were doing that 20 years ago.
They're doing it more now.
Are they doing it more
and
now?
people line up at their tables. And we're just trying to grab folks to ours. And we did have, I saw one girl, semi-jokingly, I heard her say as she walked by, there it is. And I said, you found Bixby, perfect, come on over. And she was looking for Bixby.
Yes, ma'am.
So do we have classrooms available for all these teachers
Oh.
currently?
You knew exactly where I was going. That's part of our problem this year, is at West, and I see Miss McNamara back there.
I was going to say, Libby should sit down.
Libby has
Yeah.
teachers and support staff assigned to closets and stages and behind the curtain and wherever she can put them. And that's
the term office.
that's right. Because the growth at West has been through the roof. So we are adding classrooms, 10 on the elementary, 10 on the intermediate side. But of those numbers that I just put up, at least 8 or 9 of those are new positions at West. And so we are filling those classrooms literally as fast as we're building them. And there's very little room for growth. And so we have to constantly say, okay, when can we build another school? And it's that bonding capacity and being able to manage that as well. Our East campuses are very full as well. And so we're probably taking over science labs or other spaces that we used to leave open. And now we're going to have to assign teachers to those just to address the class size issue. We will do what's called a demographic study early next year. And there's potential that we may have to shift some students from, especially on the north side, between east and north. And I'm hoping we don't have to do the same thing on the south side, that we can build more classrooms prior to that. But those are concerns, because again, we have to be able to build those classrooms too. We can't put up the sign. Libby has asked me, can we just put up a "we're full" sign?
Yeah. No vacancy.
There's no more room. And unfortunately, public schools cannot do that. Private schools can absolutely do that and say, we're full. Or you're not doing as well as we thought you would, so you're gone. Or you're not behaving yourself. Or you have an IEP. Or you have other needs that we don't want to deal with, so go back to your public school. Right. So this last is just the recipe. And then I want to just talk a little bit, and I'll bring the representative back up a little bit. So here's a formula for success. We need adequate numbers of schools and classrooms. That's based on our bonding capacity, our ability to pass school bonds. We need operational funds to recruit, retain, hire, train. That's our local, state, and federal revenues that contribute to that. This one is on us. We need a sustained culture of excellence where teachers want to work here, that they see they can meet their purpose, they can help students excel in a nurturing learning environment. This one is on all of us. We need to respect and appreciate the work that our educators do every year in our community, in our state, and nationally. And if we do that, we can have happy, successful, and well-educated students. But all of those things have to be in play. So going back to that 28 to 42 students that's going to cost us somewhere over $2 million, we don't know that we have that money yet. We know that with growth, we will get additional funding through the state aid formula. We don't know how much that is. So an analogy that I would give you is if your employer said, hey, we're thinking of giving you a raise this summer. We're not sure how much it's going to be, but you're going to get one. Would you immediately say, well, I can afford a boat now? No, because you would say, well, how much is that raise going to be? Is it going to be guaranteed raise? Is it going to be a one-time stipend? Is it going to be something I can count on being in my salary from this point on? Because if it's not, then I can't make decisions. Well, because of the way we have to identify those positions we need so that we can go to job fairs, we can host our own job fair, we can start recruiting teachers to come to Bixby for next year, because by the end of school, if we're not done hiring at least 90% of those positions, we're not going to find them. Not going to find them. Those teachers will have already accepted contracts with their existing school, or they have landed somewhere else. And the way the law is written is that teachers have to be given a letter of assurance saying you have been retired or rehired for next year, and they have 2 weeks past the first Monday in June that if they decide to retire, resign, go somewhere else, that they can still do that. But after that point, they are locked into the contract with the school district that they have. So even if we post a position in late June and we find a great math teacher over at Union that says, I want to come to Bixby, Union can say, we're not letting you go. They are tied to that contract. So we have to be very aggressive and proactive and hire teachers while school's still going. There's a chance that we won't even know what the budget is until, what's the last week?
The last Thursday in May.
The last Thursday in May. As we're getting out of school and we hopefully will have hired most of these positions, we may not know how much money, whether we could afford that boat or not.
That's true.
And we hope that it's there just based on our growth. But how nice would it be to have that information on the first day of April, which is what the law used to be, that our legislature was never able to do, so that we could say, here's the positions we can hire, here's the pay raises we can implement, here are the incentives we can put in, here are the programs or electives we can add for next year. We could make much better decisions if we knew what that funding is going to look like starting on July 1.
I will say we did solve the problem of not getting the budget out by the deadline of April 1st. We moved the deadline.
Now there is no deadline, right? You just got rid of the deadline. But it really would be very beneficial for us. So that's the challenge we have. We're going to go ahead and make decisions because we work closely with our CFO. We have a pretty good idea of what that money would be, but it would be nice to know if there's going to be any new money so that we could add additional support staff and look at how we can provide the programs that our kids need. All right, with that, I'm just going to open it up. Yes?
I know that we hire high quality teachers, and I know that one of the things that we have is that teachers are saying it's hard to teach such a large class size. I feel like they even feel bad because it's we're trying, but we also have a very large class. So can you remind me what's in the bond? Because we're restricted by our bond capacity, which is keeping us from building. What are we currently bonded for? Because I know I know we're above 85% indebtedness threshold, but can you remind me what all's in our bond right now that's keeping us from getting another bond and building more classrooms beyond that?
gets really into the weeds, but we are essentially 100% bond indebted, which means that each year as we retire old bonds and sell new bonds, we are keeping right at that 100%. So we can't ask, like this year we're selling $21 million worth of bonds. And that's money we can use for these capital improvements. I can't go out and say, well, I'd like to have $25 million this year, because we would then exceed that sinking fund limit, which is 10% of our net assessed valuation.
But what are we currently using our bond money for?
Bond money
Because
is going.
isn't it earmarked? It's like specific.
Yes,
every
right,
time we
it
do
is. So
what is
our bond funds are either paying off. There's something called the sinking fund, which I talked about last time. So the sinking fund is the money that goes to pay the debt accrued from selling of bonds. So we're paying off that sinking fund each year. Right now, we did a lease purchase associated with the 2022 bond of nearly $100 million. We are using that $100 million to pay for the construction and architecture services for the new high school, the expansion in West, the new track building that got added. We added new bleachers. We're adding a gym at East Intermediate. We're putting new canopies for drop-off and pickup and bus ovals at many of our schools, and other smaller projects associated with that, to include a renovation and upgrades to the home of the Spartans, new locker rooms, and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of projects that go to that, but those were all promised to the patrons when we passed that bond issue. That's what the community voted on, and we feel obligated to meet those requirements as much as we can. So until we get to a point where we paid off enough of those older bonds, which right now looks to be 27 or 28, before we can have another larger bond issue that could support building a school or something of that nature, it takes us that many years to get to that point. So I guarantee the next bond issue will have another elementary intermediate school. Has to happen. We've just got to be able to sustain that. Fortunately, we'll have the high school done. The middle school, 9th grade center can sustain a few more years of growth before they get packed again. But we're in better shape now than we have been, even though our class sizes are pretty full. But Jenks, Union, Broken Arrow, they've all experienced the same sort of thing. When you're on that high growth rate and you still have lots of land, Jenks and Union are kind of landlocked right now. Broken Arrow still got a lot of land. Bixby still has a lot of land. So we're going to be on this ride for a while. Did that answer?
Yeah, I was just trying to think of like where we could get the money, like if it was something that we could shift bonds around or things like that.
I was hoping T. Boone Pickens would leave a little left out. Yes, Mr. David.
Just one that's clarifying, but there was two things that you said I wanted to touch on. So the regional 6-year average or 6-year look at the regional teacher pay slide, you mentioned that there's been nothing since 2019, and I would rather have a slide that highlighted that, just for me, like what can I do? Well, I can talk about that. Not that one, the one that's horizontal. Oh, sorry. There you go. So what am I looking at there, the 21% increase
That's a good point. I'm glad you asked that. So there were 7,300 that was part of legislative action that was tied to pay raises that were stipulated by the House and Senate. Then school districts have made up that other difference. So that the difference between the 4,500 and 54 is 9,000 something. That has been just on the backs of schools using their available general fund revenue to build in additional funds on their salary
So this
scale.
is not a slide talking about state increases. This is a slide talking about just
Right. So, for instance, we negotiate with our Bixby Education Association every year, and we have added money to our salary scale that's above the state minimum because, again, it's a negotiation. Like last year, we added money to each step above what they would normally get. And so that's what school districts have done. They've built in additional money just to stay ahead of that. But obviously it's better when the legislature gives us money that's targeted to that and not putting you on the
Well,
spot.
that
only
was
we
something
had
I kind of wanted to see a slide that showed that so I could post that. It's like,
Okay.
look, we all know inflation has hit since 2019, but we haven't got more money for our teachers. And then the next thing I wanted to ask you about is there anything being talked about or brought to the legislature that would bring a teacher into the category of a state employee where they get state health benefits, like the legislature has the same health care plan as you guys?
We've had that proposed a couple of times. It's never. I don't believe we put it on the education A&P committee schedule. So the leadership has not chosen to hear any of those bills so far.
Do other states, how do they handle that?
Well, that's a good question. I'll give you the legislative response. I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, Mr. Dodson.
The frustrating thing is it seems like the legislature isn't, attacking the problem of, on both sides, not attacking the problem of not having enough teachers. And when you're in a community like ours, you see the numbers, and like Mr. Miller said, like we're just poaching from Jinx and BA, and it's a little bit frustrating that, we're not incentivizing teachers who have their certificate and that's sitting on the sidelines. My wife is one of them. She maintains her certificate, but she doesn't teach. What can the state do to incentivize, for people to come to this profession? One, obviously pay, anyways, it's kind of maddening a little bit that nobody's really addressing. It's like, we'll just pass the buck to next year, and nobody's addressing it. Like, it's a major problem, especially in the urban areas. A lot of the citizens of our community, probably the number one complaint is class sizes, and what they don't understand, or maybe they understand, but it's like, we're only as good as our enrollment numbers. And like Mr. Miller said, it's like, we hire people. When are we done really hiring? May?
We're still hiring.
We're always hiring, but
Yes.
we try to be done.
We try to be done by June.
And our
Yeah,
enrollment
yeah.
packets go out through the spring. We need every parent to fill those out so we have a head count. But what's not factored in is they grow throughout the year, and those kids show up. And so kindergarten to second grade, they got to go to school, right? So our class size goes from 24 to 27 to 30. And how hard is it to hire a teacher in November?
We're still hiring.
We're always hiring. You know what I mean? So it just seems like the state, it's like every 2-3 years we're going to reshuffle the money on the table, but we don't attack the issue of we don't have enough students coming out of our universities. How many people, you just said at NSU, a heavy teaching school, how many people came to the job fair from NSU?
From NSU, they had a total of 71 graduates across the state in education, period. Not even close to 71 came, because if they are already student teaching somewhere, they are likely to work there. And we brought back from NSU, I'm going to say 12 at the most resumes. It was not a lot. And of those, 3 special education graduates in the state from NSU. 3. And one of them I wouldn't have hired. And the other 2, we met one of them, and I brought her resume back, and the other one is likely going elsewhere.
Yeah. Anyways, my question is, in your inner circles and conversations, and even with Republicans, what's the conversation about attacking teacher shortage?
Well, let me put my bipartisan hat on. This is one of my important issues. I did an interim study on this, actually over the last couple of years. I've done a series of studies that demonstrate that the root solution has to be to improve the number of people in our 4-year universities getting education degrees and then coming to teach in Oklahoma schools. So I ran a bill in 2019 for tuition reimbursement for our education graduates. It didn't advance, but something even better happened. The idea was appropriated by the other side and then became the Inspire to Teach grant, which we put $17 million into it last year to give tuition scholarships to students in our education programs and stipends for them to come and teach in Oklahoma schools after that. I can tell you that over the last 10 years, our numbers going into our education schools have continued to decline. The good news is we may have hit bottom, and we're starting to see some evidence of recovery of numbers, or at least flat numbers in our schools. But we need to put another $17 million into the Inspire to Teach Fund, and we need to keep funding it because those teachers, the graduates of our four-year programs, are the ones who are most likely to stay and become career teachers. We're not going to get a professional teaching corps, even out of talented emergency certified teachers or adjunct teachers, troops to teachers, alternative, Teach for America. All of those are going to tend to have shorter career lifespans than our four-year graduates. So that's a good solution. But $17 million on the scale of things is a minor investment, and we need to do a lot more. Part of it is the rhetoric you were getting to a discussion which we had in the legislature about ghost students, the idea that schools were counting students but weren't actually teaching them. Flipping your story, what you're saying is that schools are actually carrying more students than they could get enrollment numbers for, so they're actually teaching more with less. We took a statistic over the last couple of years about overcounting of students. And argued that districts were teaching less with more. The only place where that actually was happening was epic charter schools. And unfortunately, we flipped that argument to use it as a way to attack the idea of carryover in school districts. So in the legislature, we're doing some good things. We need to do much more, but we still tend to listen to the wrong rhetoric, or we tend to take short solutions like the adjunct teacher fix, which what you discover is, if this is our primary pipeline, the four-year colleges, and then we add in alternatively certified, emergency certified adjunct teachers as pipelines below that one, what happens is that your supply of available teachers doesn't increase. They just take the easier routes. Because after all, why should you go through a four-year program, do your 1 year of observation in the classroom, and then come into a classroom and get paid the same amount as the emergency certified teacher who did none of those things, or the adjunct teacher who we believe they have college degrees, but we don't know if they have college degrees. And then that four-year product comes into a classroom with their pedagogy, with their observation, but they're brand new teachers, they're struggling to keep up, and the teacher next door needs their help because they're not qualified. So we haven't quite come to terms with it. I want to salute Senator Pemberton and Representative Mark McBride for running the Inspire to Teach program. It's a sign that we are trying to do something right. But $17 million when we're sitting on, $1 billion of surplus revenue is frustrating. And here's the dilemma. We had, minuscule increases in education funding last year, flat budgets essentially. We haven't put in significant investments in teacher salaries since 2019, even as revenues rose and we sat on larger and larger sums of money. This year, what we're going to try to do with that is to cut taxes and turn that money back it's the taxpayers' money. You can make that argument, but we're making conscious decisions about where we want to put our resources. And one of our tax cut proposals is a flat tax, which would shift more of it, which would reduce the tax burden, but shift more of it onto working class Oklahomans to the benefit of wealthier Oklahomans. And that creates an equity issue. And of course, compounding that equity issue is the fact that that will reduce the amount of money to invest in public education. More than half of the students in public education are, of course, at the poverty level. So the issue here is whether we're going to zero in and focus on the fact that we've got 700,000 students in our public schools, more than ever before in our history. If you think public schools are failing, how come our numbers keep going up? Why are more and more people choosing public schools? But if we fund if we go with a voucher and tax cut format, we could, Mr. Sandman, that's all right. We could further compound the divide between the haves and the have-nots, because the haves will benefit from a $5,000 tax credit. You have to make like $160,000 to even have a $5,000 estate tax liability. So we'll put those kids in private schools while we put less and less resources into the schools for everybody else. And I'm going to close this part with one warning story. I've been on a faith tour in my district, going to different churches each Sunday. And I went to a church where I vote in my district, right down the street from me. Older congregation, half filled. They were closing and selling the church to a Christian startup school next door. The next week, I went to that church where the minister was selling T-shirts and chicken, and it was bizarre. And he was toting the tax cut, the vouchers, and how they were going to help this school operate. But not, I think, for the benefit of the people in the congregation. They were not making $160,000, I can tell you that. And I went and looked at the website of the school. And the school twice in its admission statement said, we don't discriminate on the basis of race, color, creed, or biological gender. Biological gender. So what you see is we're touching on one of the cultural issues today. What they mean is that they're going to keep transgender kids out of your schools. And probably also LGBTQ students. What they were going to do is they're going to take, and that's fine. If it's a private school, they can operate how they want. But if we're going to direct public resources to schools that are setting up dog whistles about how they're going to keep social change out of the classroom, we have a difficult problem. What we have is, if you put together all the dots that I've identified, what we've established in the state is a rhetoric that's designed to attack and blame our public schools for the way our society is changing, and then providing people with a false choice that there's an alternative to what's going on in our godless public schools. Just as a quick aside, no, there was always prayer in my classroom on test day. And we're going to pose our public schools as some kind of godless, failing institutions while allowing publicly funded discrimination in private schools. And I think that's what I mean when I say this is about money and power. We have to remember that our public schools are the cornerstones of our societies. That there's See You at the Pole Day. There's a Fellowship of Christian Athletes who have just as much right to make announcements about their meetings after school as the chess club. And that our public schools are a marketplace of ideas where people of different faith values can come together and grow stronger in their faith. And that we should continue to fund and support them. And this all comes back to teacher retention. Because if we don't keep supporting the democratic ideal of our public schools, we're not going to have a democratic core of teachers, period. Not just in our public schools, but in the private schools, which routinely hire our people. And what we're going to get is an undereducated populace and an undemocratic society. It's all of a piece. Thank you. I won't drop the mic.
Well, I know our time is up. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming here today. You can call me anytime if you want to follow up on any of the topics that we talked about today or anything throughout the year. I encourage you to do that. I want to thank Kayla again. Thank you for being a Big Street Park teacher. We want you to stay. And a homework assignment for everyone in here who had a name of a teacher, and Jolie, it sounds like some of you are already doing this. Write a letter or send a text or contact that teacher who made that difference and remind them just what a difference and how they impacted your life. Because it does matter. And I run into students all the time who share brief anecdotes or stories. I know Ms. Nelson and other teachers in here do the same thing. It helps. It really does. Because it reminds you that every single day as an educator, you have the awesome ability to make an impact in the life of a child. So thank you for all you do, and thank you for coming today.